Imagine you are falling. You're just sinking right through the incredibly warm, super vibrant, sunlit waters of the Gulf of Mexico.
Right, just perfectly clear water.
Yeah, exactly. It is this brilliant, blinding turquoise at the surface. But, as you drop, that light just simply cannot follow you down.
It fades fast.
So fast. By 200 feet, the bright turquoise fades into this heavy, bruised indigo, and by 1,000 feet, the last scattered, just exhausted photons of sunlight have been swallowed entirely by the water column. You are now entering the midnight zone.
Which is just a terrifying environment on its own.
Oh, absolutely. The temperature plummets to near freezing, and the physical weight of the ocean above you is building to these unimaginable, crushing levels. And as you fall further, reaching a staggering depth of 5,000 feet, your feet finally touch the muddy, freezing floor of the abyss.
Complete isolation.
Completely.
Mm-hmm.
You're standing in a graveyard, completely devoid of light, where the only movement is the slow drift of pale marine snow. But if you were to somehow, turn on a massive high-powered floodlight down there, the beam would cut through the darkness to reveal something that absolutely does not belong in this alien landscape.
It really doesn't.
Resting in the mud are two massive, mangled steel corpses, just lying in the freezing silence, less than 2 miles apart from one another. One is the ruined bulk of an American passenger steamer, and the other is a highly advanced, incredibly lethal predator, a German U-boat.
Wow.
I want to bring you, the listener, directly into this space today because we are going to do a deep dive into a real-life horror story. A story of a predator violently stalking American waters, a sudden catastrophic disaster, a tragic scapegoat, and a 59-year-old phantom that locals called the ghost boat of the Gulf. Okay, let's unpack this.
It is, it's a profoundly chilling scene to visualize, and quite frankly, it's terrifying to analyze. We are looking at the remnants of July 1942. It's a moment of absolute, unspeakable violence frozen in time at the very bottom of the ocean.
Right.
But to really grasp the terror of this incident, we have to completely reframe how we think about naval warfare. And this isn't just, a historical account of ships shooting at each other on the open water. This is a story about the terrifying collision of human vulnerability, the unforgiving physics of the deep ocean, and a deeply entrenched historical mystery.
It's man against nature just as much as man against man.
Exactly. The men involved in this story were fighting an enemy, yes. But fundamentally, they were fighting the ocean itself. And for decades, the ocean just swallowed the truth of what really happened down there, keeping the secret entirely to itself.
I want to start by understanding the predator itself. Because to comprehend the disaster that eventually unfolded, I really think we first need to understand the incredibly hostile, terrifying environment of the weapon.
Oh, the U-boat.
Yeah. I know the German submarine lying down there is the U-166. But what exactly was this machine? When you look at the specs and the source material, what kind of nightmare are we talking about here?
Well, we are talking about a Type IXC U-boat of Nazi Germany's Kriegsmarine. It was laid down in December 1940 at a shipyard in Wesermünde and formally commissioned into service in March 1942.
Okay, so it's brand new.
Brand new. Under the command of an officer named Oberleutnant Sir C. Hans-Günther Kuhlmann. Now, the Type IXC was specifically designed for long-range, deep ocean operation. It wasn't meant for, coastal defense.
It was an apex predator.
Exactly. Built to project power across entire oceans. But to understand the true horror of it, you have to look at its dimensions. The submarine was 251 feet long overall.
That sounds massive.
It does, but that outer shell wasn't watertight. The only thing keeping the crew alive, the actual pressure hull, was just 192 feet long and a mere 14.5 feet wide.
Wait, let me just visualize that. 14.5 feet wide.
Yeah.
I'm picturing a single lane of traffic on a highway, or maybe a modest suburban living room. And you're telling me they stretched that width into a tube and packed an entire crew inside. How many people were living in that space?
On this final patrol, there were 52 men aboard.
Oh my God.
Imagine taking 52 full-grown men and sealing them inside a steel tube the width of your living room for weeks on end.
That is, it sounds less like a ship and more like a reverse pressure cooker.
Yeah.
Instead of keeping the pressure inside, you are desperately trying to keep the unimaginably heavy, crushing pressure of the entire ocean outside. I'm trying to picture the sheer claustrophobia of existing in that environment.
claustrophobia barely begins to cover the psychological reality of it. The psychological terror of that environment is almost impossible for a modern person sitting in a comfortable room to fully process. You are entirely, completely reliant on this single curved sheet of steel to survive. Inside that tube, the air rapidly grows stale. It is thick with the inescapable stench of unwashed bodies, human waste, and the heavy metallic smell of diesel fuel and battery acid.
Just a horrific sensory experience.
Absolutely. There was no real privacy, barely any room to walk without turning sideways, and the environment inside actively mirrored the hostility outside. When the submarine dove to hide or attack, the temperature inside the metal tube would plummet to match the surrounding ocean.
So they're freezing in the dark.
Freezing. Condensation would form on every surface, cold water dripping constantly from the steel ceiling, soaking their bunks, their clothes, their skin. And all the while, every single man on board was painfully, acutely aware of the physics of their situation.
Pressure.
Exactly. The U-166 had a test depth of 230 meters, which is roughly 755 feet. At that depth, the water pressure is immense. It is literally squeezing the hull from every conceivable direction.
I read accounts in our sources where submariners talk about the sounds the metal makes. If you are sitting in the dark, surrounded by hundreds of feet of water, what are you actually hearing?
You are hearing the ocean trying to crush you.
Jesus.
As the submarine descended, the immense hydrostatic pressure would physically compress the hull. The men inside would hear the steel groaning. They would hear loud, terrifying pops and cracks echoing through the length of the boat as the metal contracted, as valves tightened, as the entire structure warped under the weight of the water.
Just a constant reminder of death.
It was a constant auditory reminder that they were suspended in a medium that wanted them dead.
How absolutely terrifying. To simply exist in that space, to try and sleep, to eat, to breathe while the walls are audibly screaming under the pressure. And they weren't just surviving down there, they were going into active, lethal combat.
Right.
Because this wasn't a research vessel.
Can you walk me through the arsenal this thing was carrying? It was a floating armory. The U-166 was armed with 22 highly explosive torpedoes. It had 6 torpedo tubes, 4 in the bow for forward attacks, and 2 in the stern for firing while fleeing.
Wow.
On top of that, it carried heavy deck guns for surface engagements, including a massive 10.5-centimeter naval gun and various anti-aircraft weaponry. But to haul all of that steel and high explosives across the ocean, it required a very specific and heavily flawed method of propulsion.
Oh, the dual engines.
Right. It relied on a dual system, supercharged diesel engines for when it was on the surface, and electric motors for when it was submerged.
Well, I want to push back on that for a second. Why build a submarine with 2 completely different types of engines? Wouldn't that take up massive amounts of that already precious internal space? It seems overly complicated for an environment where simplicity usually equals survival.
It was incredibly complicated, but mathematically necessary for the technology of the era. And what's fascinating here is how that exact engineering limitation dictated the entire rhythm of life, stealth, and terror for the crew.
How so?
Well, the supercharged diesel engines were incredibly powerful. They produced 4,400 horsepower, allowing the U-boat to travel on the surface at speeds over 18 knots. It gave them a massive range of over 13,000 nautical miles.
That's huge.
But diesel engines rely on internal combustion. They need oxygen. They need to breathe the open air. To run them, the submarine absolutely had to be on the surface, completely exposed to the horizon and the sky.
Right. And the moment they dive, they lose the air. So they had to shut the diesel engines down.
Exactly. The moment they seal the hatches and submerge, they have to physically decouple the diesel engines and switch over to the electric motors, which were powered by massive banks of lead-acid batteries stored in the belly of the sub.
I'm guessing those aren't very fast.
Not at all. The electric motors were weak. They only produced about 1,000 horsepower combined. Submerged, the submarine's top speed plummeted to around 7 knots. But worse than the speed was the endurance.
The battery life.
Yeah, their range on battery power was a mere 63 nautical miles before the batteries would completely drain.
Wait, that is a staggering drop-off in capability from thousands of miles of range to basically just a few dozen miles.
It really is, and that is the core of the U-boat's vulnerability. When they were on the surface, they were fast and had endless range, but they were highly visible and vulnerable to aircraft and ship radar. When they were submerged, they were invisible, but they were practically blind, agonizingly slow, and running on a strict, terrifying countdown timer until their batteries died and they suffocated.
So diving is basically a massive risk every time.
Huge risk. This meant that the chaotic moments of crash diving from the surface to the depths, shutting down the roaring diesel, sealing the valves, and transitioning to silent battery power was the most dangerous and anxiety-inducing procedure for the crew. They were trading speed and air for a temporary, fragile invisibility.
Okay, so we have established this claustrophobic, terrifying, heavily armed machine and the sheer dread of operating it. Now, I want to trace its path, because its hunting ground is what brings this story so uncomfortably close to home.
The Gulf.
Yes. The U-166 had a very short, brutal lifespan. Its first patrol took it around the British Isles to France in June of 1942. But it's the second patrol that really sets up the horror of this narrative. Our sources state that on June 17, 1942, it departed Lorient, France, sailed across the Atlantic Ocean, and slipped into the incredibly warm, surprisingly close waters of the Gulf of Mexico.
The geography is a crucial component of the psychological terror here. In the summer of 1942, the average American civilian felt relatively insulated from the European theater of the war.
Yeah, the war was over there.
Right, the battlefields were oceans away. The idea that a highly advanced steel war machine from Nazi Germany was actively prowling just off the sunny beaches of Florida or the coast of Louisiana was a literal nightmare scenario.
Complete.
But from a strategic standpoint, the Gulf of Mexico was an absolute goldmine for a U-boat commander. It was rich with slow-moving, unprotected shipping targets. You had oil tankers from Texas, cargo freighters, and passenger ships moving up from the Caribbean and South America.
Fish in a barrel.
Essentially. The U-166 arrived in these waters with a singular lethal purpose, and almost immediately it began leaving a trail of destruction.
I want to look at that trail because this tally leading up to the main event is just grim. We are in mid-July of 1942. This predator is silently slipping through the warm Gulf waters, stalking its prey.
Just waiting in the dark.
On July 11th, it encounters a tiny 84-ton vessel from the Dominican Republic called the Carmen. It fires, sinks it, and one person is killed. 2 days later, on July 13th, it sets its sights on an American ship, the Oneida.
A bigger target.
Much larger, over 2,300 tons. It sinks that ship too, taking 6 lives. Then on July 16th, it encounters the Gertrude. The Gertrude was a microscopic 16-ton vessel, and the U-boat sinks it as well, though thankfully without any casualties.
It demonstrates the sheer ruthlessness of the U-boat campaign. To a U-boat commander, any vessel contributing to the Allied supply chain, no matter how small, was a valid target.
It is so incredibly unsettling to picture this. Try to imagine the contrast. You have these unarmed merchant vessels, maybe a small fishing boat or a coastal freighter, just sailing through the Gulf. The sailors on the deck are looking out at the sunny, flat surface of the water.
Just a beautiful summer day.
Right. Maybe they are swatting at mosquitoes in the humid July air, completely unaware that a few dozen feet below them, 52 men in a freezing, groaning steel tube are tracking their every move through a periscope.
It is the ultimate expression of asymmetric terror. The merchants on the surface have no sonar, they have no heavy weaponry, and they have absolutely no way to see the threat until the torpedo is already rushing toward them.
They're defenseless.
Completely. Down in the dark, the crew of the U-166 is looking through the crosshairs of the periscope. The commander is making cold, calculated mathematical adjustments based on the target's estimated speed, the angle on the bow, and the trajectory.
They're doing all this math manually, too.
Yes. They flood the torpedo tubes, equalizing the immense water pressure so they can open the outer doors, and then they fire.
And what does that look like from the surface? If I'm standing on the deck of one of those targeted ships, what is the warning?
Often there is no warning at all. If the sea is very calm, an incredibly observant lookout might spot a faint, fast-moving trail of white bubbles streaking just beneath the surface of the water, pointing directly at the ship like a terrifying arrow.
But by then it's too late.
Exactly. By the time you see the wake of the torpedo, you have seconds to react. A ship carrying thousands of tons of cargo cannot suddenly swerve. For the victims on ships like the Oneida, the very first indication that they had sailed into a war zone was the sudden, catastrophic, deafening explosion tearing through the steel hull beneath their feet.
God, the panic.
That concussive blast is instantly followed by the shrieking of tearing metal, the immediate flooding of the lower decks, and the desperate, chaotic struggle to abandon ship and survive in the water. Within days, the U-166 had transformed the Gulf of Mexico from a vital commercial artery into a slaughterhouse.
And that creeping dread, that silent, calculated stalking, culminates a few days later on July 30, 1942. I want to set the scene here carefully. The location is roughly 45 miles south of the Mississippi River Delta.
That is extremely close to shore.
Just let that geography sink in for a moment. 45 miles from the Louisiana coast. You could practically smell the marshland on the wind. The target this time is the United States passenger steamer, the SS Robert E. Lee.
A huge ship.
Massive. Over 5,100 tons packed with passengers and cargo. But this time, the target isn't alone. It is being protected by an escort, a U.S. Navy subchaser designated PC-566, captained by Lieutenant Commander Herbert G. Claudius.
So this completely changes the mathematics of the engagement.
Because it's an armed escort.
Right. The Robert E. Lee was a massive prize, heavily loaded. But choosing to attack an escorted vessel fundamentally shifts the dynamic for a U-boat commander. It elevates the situation from a relatively low-risk execution-style ambush into a highly dangerous, potentially suicidal combat engagement.
Because now the hunter becomes the hunted.
Exactly. U-boats were assassins. They were not designed for prolonged brawls with specialized naval warships. By revealing his position to fire a torpedo, Oberleutnant Coleman knew he would instantly draw the wrath of the escort vessel. He had to weigh the value of the passenger steamer against the very real possibility that it might be his final act.
And he makes the fateful decision to strike anyway. The U-166 fires a torpedo directly at the Robert E. Lee. The impact is absolutely devastating.
Just tearing the ship apart.
Yeah. The sources describe the immediate horror on the surface. The passenger steamer is hit hard and critically damaged. In the ensuing chaos and the rapid sinking of this massive ship, 25 people lose their lives.
Which is horrific.
Imagine the absolute panic on that passenger deck.
Yeah.
You have civilians. You have the sudden, massive explosion, the deck immediately listing to one side as the ocean rushes into the lower compartments. Passengers are scrambling, fighting for lifeboats, staring down at the dark water rising to meet them.
Total nightmare scenario.
But while the Robert E. Lee is experiencing its final agonizing death throes, the escort vessel, PC-566, snaps into immediate violent retaliation.
This is where the narrative shifts from a stalking horror to an intense, high-speed tactical battle, and we can only fully understand the sequence because of incredibly detailed deep-water marine survey data that was collected decades later, allowing us to reconstruct the battle minute by minute.
Right.
Lieutenant Commander Claudius on the PC-566 doesn't hesitate for a second. He sees the explosion rip into the steamer. He instantly scans the water and spots the white wake of the U-boat's periscope slipping through the waves.
He's got a visual.
He does. He orders his patrol craft to flank speed and charges directly at the threat. But crucially, Claudius directs his ship on a very specific approach vector. He realizes the periscope has a limited field of view, much like looking through a narrow pipe. By adjusting his angle of attack, he keeps the PC-566 in the U-boat's blind spot as he races toward them.
Oh, wow. So the U-boat crew is practically blind to the exact location of the warship bearing down on them.
Exactly. But they know they've been spotted. The periscope vanishes beneath the waves. Coleman orders a crash dive.
And this is that moment of maximum panic we discussed earlier.
Oh, absolute panic. They are desperately shutting down the diesel, securing the hatches, and angling the bow down as steeply as possible. They're trying to get deep. They're trying to hide in the thermocline.
Wait, let me stop you there, because that's an important concept. What exactly is a thermocline, and why does a submarine want to hide in one?
It's a fascinating quirk of ocean physics. The ocean isn't just a uniform pool of water. It's made up of distinct layers based on temperature and salinity. A thermocline is a transition layer where the water temperature drops rapidly over a very short depth.
Okay, so it gets cold really fast.
Right, and sound waves, like the sonar pings a surface ship uses to hunt a submarine, don't travel straight through these layers. When a sonar wave hits the cold, dense water of a thermocline, it bends or refracts, bouncing off it almost like light hitting a pane of frosted glass.
That is wild.
If a U-boat can dive below that cold layer, the surface ship's sonar will bounce off the thermocline and echo back empty, effectively making the submarine acoustically invisible.
Wow. So they're plunging into the dark, racing against the clock to slip beneath this invisible acoustic shield before the surface ship reaches them. But Claudius isn't relying just on sonar. He has their last known position, and he initiates a depth charge attack.
And this is where things get brutal.
I really want to walk through the exact deadly math of this depth charge sequence, because it completely changes how I view naval combat. It is not just sailors randomly throwing bombs into the water and hoping for the best. It is a highly calculated three-dimensional trap.
It is lethal geometry. You have to visualize the surface ship racing over the spot where the periscope just disappeared, trying to anticipate the downward-forward trajectory of the fleeing submarine.
Right. Our sources map out the exact sequence from Claudius's report. The patrol craft races over the dive spot. The crew drops the very first depth charge off the aft rack, the back of the ship. They set the hydrostatic fuse on this massive drum of explosives to detonate precisely at 250 feet deep.
Very deep.
And they drop it so that it crosses the submarine's estimated path at a 45-degree angle. Then the crew on the deck starts counting. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 seconds. At exactly 6 seconds, they launch a second charge from the back, set to explode shallower at 100 feet.
Okay, so they're staggering the depths.
Yeah. And simultaneously, they fired 2 more charges out to the left and right sides of the ship using what are called K-guns, set to explode at 150 feet.
The K-guns are critical here. These were specialized mortar-like projectors mounted on the sides of the ship. Instead of just dropping explosives behind the ship in a straight line, the K-guns fired the depth charges outward in a massive arc, landing them 30 to 50 yards away from the hull.
So they are building a net.
Essentially, yes.
They drop the first deep charge, wait 6 seconds, drop a shallow charge, and fire 2 medium-depth charges out to the sides. Then they count again. 6 more seconds pass. They roll a final charge off the back, set to explode deep again at 250 feet. It's a bracket.
A deadly bracket.
They are creating a literal cage of high explosives in the water column, designed to trap the diving submarine no matter if it turns left, right, stays shallow, or dives deep.
It is an inescapable gauntlet of immense concussive force. But to truly understand the terror of the 52 men trapped inside the U-166, you have to understand the physics of what a depth charge actually does. Because it doesn't need to physically touch the submarine to destroy it.
Wait, can you explain that? Because in my head, I picture an explosion, like on land, shrapnel hitting a target. How does an underwater explosion actually kill a steel hull?
It's entirely different and far more violent. Water is non-compressible.
Right.
When a depth charge detonates underwater, the high explosives instantly vaporize into a massive, rapidly expanding gas bubble. This bubble violently shoves the surrounding water out of the way.
Okay, makes sense.
But the sheer weight and hydrostatic pressure of the surrounding ocean immediately fights back, crushing that gas bubble back in on itself in a fraction of a second. The bubble compresses until it can't anymore, and then it violently rebounds, exploding outward a second time.
Oh, wow. So it's a double hit.
Exactly. This rapid expansion, collapse, and rebound creates a devastating hydraulic shockwave that travels through the water at incredible speed.
I'm trying to picture that shockwave hitting the submarine. What is an analogy for that kind of force?
Imagine holding a heavy, liquid-filled rubber balloon in your hands, and someone strikes the side of that balloon as hard as they can with a solid wooden baseball bat.
Ouch.
Right. The energy of that strike transfers instantly through the liquid. That is what the shockwave does to the pressure hull. If a submarine is caught within the lethal radius of that shockwave, the steel hull isn't hit by shrapnel. It is violently, uniformly hammered by a wall of hardened water.
The pressure just spikes everywhere at once.
Exactly. The immense force causes the submarine to physically whip and shudder. The steel plates buckle under the kinetic impact. The iron rivets holding the hull together shear off and pop like gunshots inside the cabin. The watertight seams split open, and the high-pressure ocean water instantly, violently jets into the interior of the sub, severing electrical lines and flooding the compartments.
God, I have to pause the narrative right here, because I am trying to put myself in that space, and it is almost unbearable to think about. Walk me through what those final seconds felt and sounded like for the 52 men inside the U-166.
Yeah.
They're plunging into the dark, trying to escape. They are completely blind to the surface. What happens?
It is the purest definition of nightmare. You are enclosed in that 14.5-foot wide steel tube. The emergency lights are likely flickering, or the power has failed entirely, plunging you into a terrifying, blood-red gloom, or absolute pitch blackness.
You can't see anything.
Nothing. Above you, transmitting clearly through the water and the hull, you hear the propellers of the PC-566 roaring directly overhead. Submariners called it the sound of an approaching freight train.
It just gets louder and louder.
Right, until it feels like it's going to crush the ceiling. Then it passes. You are holding your breath, staring at the steel above you, waiting in the sudden quiet. And then the ocean itself seems to tear apart.
The first charge goes off.
Yes. The first deep charge detonates. Even if it's out of range, the sound alone is a deafening metallic crack that reverberates through the hull, shaking every bone in your body. It sounds like a massive hammer striking a bell you are trapped inside.
But they don't have time to react.
No. Because then the lethal math of Claudius's bracket catches up to them. The sources and later acoustic models indicate that either the 100-foot charge or one of the 150-foot K-gun charges on the starboard side reaches its exact detonation depth at the precise moment the descending U-166 passes nearby. The hydraulic shockwave slams into the pressure hull.
But the U-boat doesn't die instantly from that first hit, right?
Yep.
The attack critically damages them, but they somehow survive the initial barrage. The U-166 manages to change course. They turn north, limping away in the dark, bleeding oil, desperately trying to keep the water out.
They are severely wounded, likely taking on water, and struggling to maintain depth control. But Lieutenant Commander Claudius isn't finished. 10 minutes later, the PC-566 sweeps back over the area, re-engages the sonar contact, and drops a final barrage of depth charges.
Just hammering them again.
And soon after those explosions rock the ocean, a thick, undeniable oil slick appears on the surface of the Gulf.
Those final explosions were the death blow?
Yes. The internal damage from the first barrage severely weakened the structural integrity of the pressure hull. It was already compromised, already fighting the incredible weight of the ocean. The shock waves from the final explosions pushed it past its breaking point. We know from the physical evidence mapped at the wreck site decades later that the U-166 suffered a catastrophic structural failure and broke apart as it sank toward its crush depth, which is around 755 feet.
What actually happens to a submarine when it breaks at crush depth? What is the physical reality of that moment?
The physical reality is one of instantaneous apocalyptic violence. The weakened hull is groaning, fighting the pressure, emitting a sound like tearing industrial fabric, and then the structural integrity completely fails.
Just gives way.
The ocean, under immense hydrostatic pressure, violently breaches the hull. The sheer force of the water jetting inside creates an implosion so powerful, so incredibly destructive, that it acts like a massive hydraulic blade. It violently shears the entire bow section of the submarine completely off the main hull.
And from 755 feet deep, these two massive ruined pieces of steel begin to fall.
They fall into the abyss. The main section of the hull, flooding rapidly, continues on a roughly northerly heading due to its residual momentum. Meanwhile, the completely severed bow section spirals downward independently.
Just raining debris.
Both of these massive sections of ruined steel, spilling debris, mechanical equipment, and the lives of 52 men into the water plummet down through the water column. They fall through the midnight zone, dropping thousands of feet in freezing darkness.
God, 5,000 feet down.
They reach terminal velocity as they sink through the abyss, until they slam into the muddy seafloor 5,000 feet down. The impact is executed with such immense kinetic force that the two sections of the submarine create substantial impact craters in the ocean floor, embedding themselves deeply in the mud, permanently entombing the entire crew in absolute silence.
The scale of that violence is absolutely staggering. But what is so fascinating and so deeply tragic about this story is what happens next. Because the physical violence subsides, the waters of the Gulf calm down.
The battle is over.
But the aftermath creates a profound shift from physical horror to psychological horror. It leaves behind a ruined career, a bitter bureaucratic betrayal, and a maritime legend that would endure for over half a century.
It really is a tragedy in two acts.
Let's look at the immediate aftermath on the surface. Lieutenant Commander Claudius, having successfully avenged the Robert E. Lee and protected the rest of the waters, returns to port with the traumatized survivors of the passenger steamer. He files his official after-action report. He details the precise, mathematically brilliant depth charge sequence we just discussed, and he formally claims the kill. He asserts to his superiors that he destroyed the U-166.
And this is where the cold, unfeeling, bureaucratic reality of the military machine sets in. The Navy brass, sitting in offices far removed from the terror and the actual events on the water, review his report. They review his tactics, and they absolutely refuse to believe him.
Wait, I have to ask how that is even possible. He is the commander of this ship. He has his entire crew as witnesses. He dropped the charges, and oil came up. How could the Navy command look at that report and just completely deny it?
Because it contradicted their established doctrines. The commanders reviewing the incident concluded from behind their desks that his depth charge pattern was theoretically flawed. They believed his spread wasn't tight enough, or that his timing was off based on their tabletop models.
So they just assumed he messed up.
Furthermore, without a physical body or a recognizable piece of the submarine floating to the surface, which rarely happens in deep water, by the way they deemed his claims entirely unsubstantiated. They didn't just dismiss his kill, they went out of their way to actively criticize his seamanship and his tactical decisions.
That is infuriating.
Lieutenant Commander Claudius was formally reprimanded. A black mark was put on his record, and he was stripped of his seagoing command. He was pulled off the ocean and sent to an anti-submarine warfare school.
The psychological toll of that betrayal is immense. Try to imagine the absolute torment of his position. You are a naval commander. You know with absolute bone-deep certainty that you executed your duty flawlessly.
He knew what he did.
He protected the coast. He hunted down and destroyed a lethal, highly advanced predator that was slaughtering American sailors. And your reward is to be disgraced, publicly humiliated, and permanently sidelined by your own commanders. He had to live the rest of his life knowing the truth, while everyone above him called him a failure.
It is a devastating emotional burden. To possess a truth that powerful and to have the institution you dedicated your life to completely erase it from the official record.
And to add severe insult to injury, the Navy doesn't just deny Claudius the kill, they eagerly give the credit to someone else entirely.
Oh, the Coast Guard.
2 days later, on August 1st, a United States Coast Guard J-4F1 Widgeon amphibious aircraft is patrolling the Gulf. The pilot spots a U-boat lingering on the surface, roughly 100 miles off the coast of Houma, Louisiana. The aircraft dives, drops its single depth charge, and reports what looks like a direct hit on the submarine as it crash dives.
So a completely different location.
Right. But the military command looks at their maps. They see that the U-166 is missing in action in that general time frame. They ignore Claudius entirely and officially decide that the Coast Guard aircraft's attack was the fatal blow. Both aircraft crewmen are treated as heroes. They are decorated with high honors for sinking the U-166.
The historical irony here is tragic and incredibly complex. The Coast Guard aircraft almost certainly did attack a German submarine that day. But modern naval historians and acoustic analysts now firmly believe the submarine they attacked was the U-171, a completely different boat operating in the area.
Wow, a different sub entirely.
Yep. The depth charge missed or caused only minor damage, and the U-171 easily survived the attack, eventually returning to Europe. But because the Navy's official bureaucratic record boldly declared that the U-166 was destroyed by an aircraft 100 miles away from where the Robert E. Lee sank, a massive, unbridgeable discrepancy was created in the historical record.
And that discrepancy is the exact seed that grows into a legend. Because when people eventually started looking for the wreck of the U-166 years later, they naturally went to the coordinates where the government said the Coast Guard sank it. And what did they find?
Absolutely nothing.
Just miles of empty mud. And that physical void, that empty ocean floor, gives birth to the legend of the ghost boat of the Gulf. Because the physical wreck was seemingly wiped from existence, rumors began to violently swirl along the coast.
People love a mystery.
They really do. For 59 years, this phantom submarine haunted the imaginations of the public and maritime historians. People claim to have terrifying sightings of a ghost U-boat, heavily rusted and covered in algae, silently patrolling the surface of the Gulf on moonless nights.
Just sailing around forever.
There were constant, conflicting reports placing the supposedly missing wreck hundreds of miles away. Some said it was off Clearwater, Florida. Others swore it was tangled in the reefs down in the Florida Keys. There were even wild, totally unsubstantiated whispers that the reason the government was lying about its location was because the submarine was secretly carrying a massive, incredibly valuable cargo of liquid mercury.
Mercury, that's quite the rumor.
The cold, hard facts were completely lost, replaced by wild maritime folklore.
If we step back and connect this to the bigger picture, it reveals something deeply profound about the human psyche and our strange, fearful relationship with the ocean. The ocean is vast, it is impenetrable, and it is entirely indifferent to human existence.
It doesn't care about our stories.
Not at all. When a massive steel ship simply disappears without a trace, it leaves an agonizing psychological void. Human beings are inherently pattern-seeking creatures. We crave resolution. We need a beginning, a middle, and an end to our stories.
We hate loose ends.
When faced with missing ships, unresolved oceanic mysteries, and conflicting official government reports, we abhor the vacuum. We cannot handle the idea that something can just vanish into the blue, so we fill that terrifying void with ghost stories.
Right, the mind makes up an answer.
We fill it with legends, with conspiracies, with tales of phantom ships and secret cargoes. The ghost boat legend wasn't just a story, it was a societal coping mechanism for a mystery that the modern technology of the mid-20th century simply couldn't solve. The ocean had swallowed the physical truth, and so the human imagination stepped in to populate those dark waters with its own fears.
I love that framing. We invent the monsters to explain the empty space. But the truth is, no matter how deeply buried underwater in bureaucracy, has a way of eventually rising to the surface.
And it certainly did here.
From the realm of myth, conspiracy, and legend, we finally transition to the cold, hard, undeniable light of modern deep-sea technology illuminating the abyss. We lead forward in time over half a century later, to the year 2001. A company called Submarine is conducting a highly detailed archaeological survey of the seafloor.
For the oil companies, right?
Yeah, they are working ahead of the construction of a massive natural gas pipeline for BP and Shell, because petroleum companies operating in the outer continental shelf of the Gulf are mandated by law to provide sonar data in areas with high archaeological potential. Two marine archaeologists, Robert A. Church and Daniel J. Warren, are tasked with analyzing the Deepwater redoubt.
Looking for anomalies.
Right. They are dragging sensors through the dark, and suddenly, in 5,000 feet of water, the sonar pings bounce back with massive, jagged, anomalous contacts.
The sheer precision of modern technology is what finally broke the ocean's 59-year silence. In 2001, they're using advanced sonar arrays towed deep underwater, far closer to the seafloor than surface sonar could ever reach.
Way better resolution.
Oh, infinitely better. They detect two very large sections of dense material lying roughly 500 feet apart, completely surrounded and connected by a sprawling, chaotic debris field. When archaeologists look at sonar, they are trained to distinguish between biology, geology, and humanity.
How does humanity look on a sonar scan?
Well, the sonar signatures bouncing back from these masses are highly distinct, sharp, and geometric. It's not a natural geological formation. It's not a coral reef. It is the unmistakable, hard acoustic shadow of a massive steel construct. It is a U-boat.
Incredible.
And crucially, the defining piece of evidence is the location. The wreck is located less than 2 miles from the known documented wreck of the passenger steamer Robert E. Lee.
Right next to its final victim.
That geographical proximity instantly, irreparably unravels the 59-year-old official Navy narrative that the sub was sunk 100 miles away.
This discovery wasn't just a massive victory for archaeological science. It was a deeply personal, incredibly emotional vindication for local historians who had dedicated their lives to the truth. The sources specifically highlight a man named Charles C.J. Christ, a resident of Houma, Louisiana.
He searched for it for years.
This man spent almost his entire adult life obsessively searching for the missing U-166. He poured his soul, his time, and his resources into finding this lost piece of history. And in 2003, when a deepwater mapping project sent a remotely operated vehicle, an ROV, essentially an underwater drone down, to visually confirm and map the site, C.J. Christ was invited to accompany the team in the control room.
What an experience that must have been.
Right. He stood there and watched the live, high-definition camera feed as the bright lights of the ROV swept across the absolute darkness of the ocean floor, finally illuminating the rusted barrel of the 10.5-centimeter gun on the aft deck. The camera panned over the encrusted conning tower, the long-lost pressure hull. The team allowed him to lay a virtual wreath, placed via coordinates, between the wreck of the Robert E. Lee and the U-166.
That is just deeply moving.
Imagine the overwhelming, crashing wave of emotion in that control room. A lifetime of endless searching, of being told it was a ghost story, finally culminating in gazing upon the undeniable physical reality of the legend.
It is a profound and deeply moving intersection of modern forensic science and historical tragedy. The ROV footage provided the undeniable visual evidence needed to rewrite the history books. They painstakingly mapped the entire site using what are called long baseline arrays.
Wait, what is a long baseline array? How does that help them understand the wreck?
Think of it like a highly precise underwater GPS system. Because radio waves don't travel through deep water, standard GPS is useless. Instead, archaeologists drop acoustic transponders around the wreck site, creating a grid on the seafloor.
Oh, so they map it with sound.
Exactly. The ROV sends out acoustic pings to these transponders, which ping back. By measuring the exact time it takes for the sound to travel, computers can triangulate the ROV's exact position to within a few centimeters. This allowed them to create a perfect three-dimensional forensic map of the destruction.
And what did that map show?
Well, the eerie visuals of the ROV cameras panning over the site confirm the catastrophic violence of the submarine's final moments. They filmed the massive impact craters dug into the mud where the two separated halves of the submarine had smashed into the seafloor at terminal velocity. But the true, undeniable forensic breakthrough, the final piece of the puzzle that completely cleared Claudius's name, came years later during a 2014 expedition led by the famous oceanographer and National Geographic explorer in residence, Robert Ballard.
Right. Ballard's team arrived with even better equipment, and they noticed something incredibly specific and telling about the wreckage. They confirmed that the submarine's bow had been completely blown off, and that it was resting on the seafloor a significant distance, 100 feet away from the main body of the pressure hull.
Yes, and that physical separation, the exact manner in which the steel was torn apart, tells a forensic story that perfectly validates Lieutenant Commander Claudius's original after-action report. The archaeological team analyzed the twisted metal and theorized that the extreme localized damage to the bow was the result of a rare direct contact hit from a depth charge, or a detonation so incredibly perfectly close to the bow that it caused a sympathetic, massive internal explosion of the U-166's own scored torpedoes.
But why does the bow being blown off prove Claudius was right? Wouldn't any depth charge do that?
Not necessarily. As we discussed earlier, standard depth charge attacks relied on near misses inflicting cumulative hydraulic shock waves to pop rivets and crack the hull, causing the sub to flood and sink relatively intact. But a direct, catastrophic explosion of the submarine's own forward torpedo magazine would instantly and violently sever the bow entirely. It perfectly explains why the submarine broke apart so rapidly and why it plummeted to the bottom in two distinct pieces. It provided the forensic proof that the crew of the PC-566 had not just gotten lucky, they had executed a nearly flawless, mathematically perfect attack.
So they were right all along.
Their depth charge bracket was so precise, it triggered the U-boat's own ammunition. It was an act of lethal, undeniable precision.
And that precise, indisputable forensic evidence, sitting in the mud for 7 decades, finally cleared the name of the man who had been so wrongfully disgraced. On December 16, 2014, 72 years after the chaotic battle on the surface of the Gulf Contrast, the Secretary of the Navy, Ray Mabuse, held a formal ceremony. He posthumously awarded Lieutenant Commander Herbert G. Claudius the Legion of Merit with a Combat V device for extreme heroism in battle.
Long overdue.
The Navy officially credited Claudius and the crew of the PC-566 with the sinking of the U-166. Secretary Mabus stood up and stated for the public record that Claudius's original after-action report was absolutely factually correct, and that it is never, ever too late to set the historical record straight.
72 years.
72 years. A man's entire life and legacy lived and died under the shadow of a reprimand, labeled a failure for a brilliant victory he had rightfully earned.
It is a stunning, incredibly bittersweet resolution to the human side of this story. The deep sea, the very environment that killed the submarine, acted as the ultimate protector of the truth. It preserved the crime scene perfectly, holding the undeniable evidence in a state of absolute freezing darkness, free from human tampering or bureaucratic revisionism, patiently waiting until our technology evolved enough to travel down there and retrieve the truth.
Like a time capsule.
The long-awaited vindication of Captain Claudius is a powerful testament to the fact that while history can be temporarily obscured by military bureaucracy, human error, and the chaotic fog of war, the physical reality of what actually happened endures.
It is a beautiful sentiment, but the story doesn't end there. Because the ocean is not a static museum, it is an active, dynamic, and incredibly complex biological environment. And that brings us to a final, deeply unsettling revelation about the fate of the U-166.
Right, the modern threat.
Just as the history of the submarine is finally being unburied and brought to the light, the physical grave itself is now under a new, bizarre form of attack. Our sources point to a major 2019 scientific study regarding the wreck. Researchers surveying the site discovered that the physical remains of the submarine are now being actively destroyed. But they aren't just rusting away normally in the saltwater. They're being rapidly devoured by mutant seabed bacteria.
It's wild to see.
And the reason this specific bacteria is suddenly thriving, multiplying at a massive, unprecedented rate and devouring the steel hull, is because it is actively feeding on the oil that rained down from the 2010 Deepwater Horizon catastrophic spill. So I have to ask, what does this all mean? We have a World War II grave, an officially protected war memorial containing the entombed remains of 52 men that is currently actively being erased from physical existence because of a modern, entirely unrelated ecological disaster. How does a scientist even process that?
It is a profoundly tragic, almost unbelievable irony, and it speaks directly to the terrifying interconnectedness of human actions across vast stretches of time. The Deepwater Horizon spill in 2010 dumped millions upon millions of gallons of complex hydrocarbons into the Gulf of Mexico. Much of that oil didn't stay on the surface, it sank, coating the abyssal depths in a toxic snow.
It's like blanketing the bottom.
Down in that pitch-black, high-pressure environment, specific, incredibly hardy strains of bacteria, like the Halomonas species, evolved or rapidly adapted their metabolisms to consume those hydrocarbons. The oil spill essentially created an all-you-can-eat buffet for these deep-sea microbes.
And the wreck is just caught in the crossfire.
Right. As a metabolic byproduct of feeding on the oil, these rapidly multiplying bacterial colonies excrete acidic wastes and secrete a dense biological film that aggressively, unnaturally accelerates the galvanic corrosion of iron and steel.
I've seen the word rusticles used to describe this. What exactly is a rusticle?
A rusticle is exactly what it sounds like. It's a structure that looks like an icicle, but it's made entirely of oxidized iron rust. It's not formed by freezing water, it's a living biological community.
Gross, but fascinating.
The Halomonas bacteria literally eat the iron out of the steel hull and build these delicate, porous, hanging structures out of the waste. They look like dark orange stalactites bleeding from the metal. The U-166, which sat in relatively stable preservation for decades in the freezing, oxygen-poor depths, is now being aggressively eaten away by these colonies.
It's vanishing.
The modern hubris of deepwater oil drilling has inadvertently, blindly unleashed a massive biological agent that is currently consuming a monument to the hubris of a global industrialized war. It is a stark, terrifying reminder that our impacts on the ocean are incredibly systemic. We don't just pollute the water column, we alter the fundamental biological mechanics of the deep-sea ecosystem, unknowingly changing the fate of everything, every ship, every secret, every memorial resting quietly on the seafloor.
It really recalibrates your entire understanding of the ocean as a space. We started this incredibly dark journey looking at a terrifying, claustrophobic machine of war. A literal predator made of steel that stalked the sunny American coast, unleashing sudden violence. We meticulously walked through a brutal 10-minute battle defined by the physics of sound, high explosives, and crushing, inescapable pressure.
A battle that history tried to forget.
We witnessed the tragedy of a hero disgraced by his own commanders, his truth replaced by a 59-year ghost legend of phantom submarines and imaginary treasures. And finally, we saw a hard-won vindication written in the mud 5,000 feet down, only to realize that the physical evidence of that vindication is now being slowly, biologically digested by the consequences of our own modern oil spills.
This specific story, from its violent beginning to its slow biological erasure, perfectly encapsulates a fundamental, terrifying truth about the marine environment. The ocean is unimaginably vast, deeply terrifying, and completely, utterly indifferent to human life, our wars, our mistakes, our need for justice, and our craving for narrative resolution.
It just doesn't care.
It will gladly swallow a massive steel ship, an entire crew, and a historical truth without creating a single lasting ripple on the surface. But it also proves that the truth, no matter how violently destroyed or deeply buried under millions of tons of water, can eventually rise back to the surface if we are technologically capable and historically persistent enough to seek it out. The story of the U-166 and the Robert E. Lee is a haunting reminder of human vulnerability, both to the lethal, highly engineered weapons we create to destroy each other, and to the relentless, unending physical and biological forces of the natural world.
I'm going to leave you with a haunting image to mull over as we end this deep dive. I want you to picture that freezing pitch-black abyss right now, at this very exact moment. Because it isn't an abstract concept, it is happening right now beneath the waves of the Gulf. As the heavy remnant oil from the Deepwater Horizon disaster continues to slowly drift across the seafloor, feeding the thriving colonies of mutant bacteria, the once impenetrable pressure hull of the U-166 is actively being devoured.
It's dissolving as we speak.
The thick German steel is turning into fragile, orange rusticles, and those rusticles are crumbling, dissolving into dust, and being carried away by the slow, freezing abyssal currents. Eventually, years from now, the entire submarine, the lethal torpedoes, the massive deck guns, and the entombed, protected remains of the 52 men inside will vanish entirely.
Hey, Rick, we're never there.
The biological processes will strip away the metal until nothing is left. They will return to the sea as if they never existed, the very chemical bonds of their history broken down and scattered across the darkness of the Gulf of Mexico. It makes you deeply, profoundly wonder what other terrifying stories of survival, of bitter betrayal, of unrecorded heroism and unimaginable tragedy are currently silently dissolving in the pitch-black depths of our oceans, waiting in the cold to be found before the indifferent sea erases them forever.